Proverbs chapter number 1. With a hand of these books out tonight, and this morning, handed these books out this morning. Just encourage you to go through it if you're able to do so. At the very least, read through Proverbs. Follow along with the church. Let's all at least read Proverbs together and follow along, and one chapter a day. It's not going to take you too long to read a chapter out of the book of Proverbs. Maybe read it a couple of times every chapter. But if you can write down some journal thoughts, maybe do it with your kids or do it in your own time, and just look through the book of Proverbs. You'll see on the third page I think it is, where it says there's helpful hints when reading Proverbs. That's basically what we're going to do tonight. I'm just going to expand upon that so that when you come to read the book of Proverbs, that you have some background information or some understanding on why it's written, where it's there, why it's there, and that's what we're going to look at tonight. If you turn to Proverbs chapter number 1, we're going to look here just as an introduction. Now I'm going to preach an introduction, and then the men are going to preach throughout it, and then at the end I will preach at the very end of it as well. So and I'll look at Proverbs 31. I think in all our times before, I've gone through Proverbs on Wednesday nights before, but I've never actually done Proverbs 31. So I'm going to look at Proverbs 31 at the very end. So here's an introduction here, though, to wisdom and to the books. It says here in verse 1, it says, the Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, to know wisdom and instruction, to perceive the words of understanding, to receive the instruction of wisdom, justice and judgment and equity, to give subtlety to the simple, to the young man knowledge and discretion. A wise man will hear and will increase learning, and a man of understanding shall attain unto wise counsels. To understand a proverb and the interpretation, the words of the wise and their dark sayings. That's what Proverbs, there are some dark sayings in the book of Proverbs, to understand them, and he says, this is what I want you to get. This is what I want you to understand. We're just going to start here tonight with a simple question. What is wisdom? Now, wisdom, we have it as wisdom, and the Hebrew word is a little bit broader than maybe what we think of wisdom, because if you read through the Old Testament, you'll find places like Exodus, when they are building the tabernacle, that they are those who have wisdom are the ones that are building. Now, let me read that verse for you so you know what I'm talking about. Exodus 31 verse 6 says this, and I, behold, I have given unto Aholiab, the son of Ahisamach, of the tribe of Dan, and in the hearts of all that are wise-hearted I have put wisdom, that they may make all that I have commanded thee. So they are the ones who are the craftsmen, Aholiab, and there's another one that comes alongside of Aholiab and helps him. But Aholiab is the one who is in charge of building the tabernacle in the wilderness. And so all of the instructions are given by God, but not every detail, just the overarching measurements and what it's going to be made out of. But the actual artifacts and actual crafting of it was done by Aholiab. And that is his wisdom. God placed the wisdom in him. And wisdom is being skillful. It's being creative is the idea of wisdom, to be this creative side of things and to be skillful. Now, wisdom in that sense, and as you come to Proverbs, is now living skillfully in this world. How to live skillfully in the world that we live in. I'll define wisdom a different way because you have down here in verse number 20, look at this, it says, wisdom crieth without. She uttereth her voice in the streets. She crieth in the chief place of concourse. In the opening of the gates, in the city she uttereth her words, saying, how long, ye simple ones, will ye love simplicity? And the scorners delight in their scorning, and fools hate knowledge. Turn you at my reproof. Behold, I will pour out my spirit unto you. I will make known my words unto you. Very central to what the Proverbs are is written to these characters, the four characters. I've dealt with these in past, in youth ministries, and also in a main service a couple of times here. I'm not going to go over them in depth, but we must at least look at them tonight, because there are four main characters in the book as you read through. There is wisdom, there is the wise, there is the fool, there is the simple, and there is the scorner. Those four characters, Solomon, the author, interweaves throughout the course of the book of Proverbs. So you will find about the simple, and you will read about the scorner, and you will read about the fool and the foolish, and you will read about the wise. Those four characters are reoccurring. Solomon does that deliberately. And he has this, as you see here in verse 20, wisdom is crying. Wisdom is the one crying forth her voice, and she is calling the young men. She is calling the simple. She is speaking to the scornful. She is speaking to the foolish. She is saying, come to me. Come eat the bread. Come eat what I have made for you. And there is always an invitation that goes out from wisdom to the children of men to be wise. There is an invitation to be wise. There is a decision that has to be made. And so you have wisdom here crying, and wisdom can be simply defined as the correct application of knowledge. It's what it means to be skillful as well. If you're going to be skillful in something, is to use it correctly and wisely. And wisdom is the correct application of knowledge. There are three other elements that are used throughout the book, and it's knowledge, wisdom, knowledge, wisdom, and understanding. I'll say it right. Knowledge, wisdom, and understanding. Those three are also mentioned throughout the book. Knowledge, my way of explaining it to teenagers, and it helps me, is to think of a jigsaw puzzle. That wisdom or that knowledge is a piece of a jigsaw puzzle. By itself, you don't really know too much about it or how to use it. But the more jigsaw puzzles you get, the more pieces of the puzzle you get together. So the more knowledge you have, there's more pieces of the puzzle. Now, wisdom is the correct application of that knowledge that you have. So a child learns very quickly that things are hot, and even Ben knows that fires are hot, and so he won't go near the fire. So he knows, he has a knowledge that says fire is hot. He also now has a wise, at least a little bit of wisdom in him to say, I'm not going to touch the fire. So he has the correct application of that knowledge. He uses that knowledge wisely because there is pain associated and he doesn't want the pain. So he doesn't touch the fireplace. We don't even have a guard around it. He just knows not to go there, not to be near it. And he's scared, the same thing with different things in our household. He won't go near because he knows the pain that's associated. So that's wisdom in that sense, even from a young age. Understanding is piecing those puzzle pieces together, and as you piece the puzzle pieces together in the right location, then you start to see a bigger picture, and you start to see things rather than just little pieces of the puzzle. We sat down, we did it at family camp, we sat down and there's just jigsaw puzzle pieces everywhere, but as everybody comes along and places them in the right place, the picture starts to evolve and you start to see it clearly, and then you're working out, why can't I just work out this section? Then someone will come along and they'll take that piece and they'll turn it upside down and push it back in, and you're like, oh, that makes sense, and all of a sudden it's clear now and you see what it is. That's what wisdom and understanding are like. They are the puzzle pieces and then putting them in the right place and seeing it, and then the wisdom is using that correctly. So wisdom is coming and saying, she's crying and saying, right, I want you, particularly young men, which we'll come to that point in a minute, but she's crying and saying, I want you to be skillful in life. I want you to correctly apply knowledge and be wise. And she cries particularly, it says here, she crieth in the chief place, verse 21, to the chief place of concourse, in the opening of the gates. In the city she uttereth her words, saying, how long, ye simple ones, will ye love simplicity? They're the first people to whom wisdom speaks, are the simple ones. Now simple, a simple organism in biology is usually a single cell organism, something that is not complex. And that's really what simple means, is not complex. So a simple person is often thinking about one thing. They're not thinking about all these different things that are going around the place. They're really only focused and thinking about one thing only. Now, this can be seen when children are often very simple. They will do things, but they're not thinking about the ramifications of what it is. If a ball is bouncing down the driveway going to the road, oftentimes that child, in their simplicity, thinks ball, must get ball, and they run for the ball. But the parent, observing the situation, calls out and says stop, because they see the danger in which they are running into. They see the roads, they see the cars, they know the surroundings. They know there's a lot more in their thoughts. They're a lot more complex in their thoughts than the child's thoughts, which are just simple thoughts. A teenager can do simple things. One thing that I always remember doing that never occurred to me before, when I was working at a supermarket, I bought an ice cream. And I got the ice cream, and I couldn't eat it right then, and I was coming off break, so I'd got the ice cream, and I was working in the fruit and veg section, so I put my ice cream in the cooler where all the fruit and veg were. And I put the ice cream in the cooler and then went working. And then at the end of the day, I went back to go get my ice cream, and it had melted in the cooler. And I was thinking, why did this melt in the cooler? This is cold. And it wasn't thinking that, right, but it's not cold enough. The freezer or the dairy section that should have been cold enough was the next freezer over, and I should have put it over there, but I put the ice cream in the fridge rather than in the freezer, big walk-in coolers. That's just simplicity. That's just being simplistic and not really thinking about the greater matters of life. And Solomon is saying, right, as you grow up, there is oftentimes a simplicity to children. But he is saying to his son, and wisdom is saying, right, you don't need to be simple. You ought not be simple. You ought to start to be more complex in your thinking and in your understanding. Solomon says in chapter number 8, I think it is, where he says, wisdom is the principal thing. So the main thing is to do the right thing. Wisdom is the principal thing. But with all thy getting, get understanding. So you should first and foremost do what is right. Whether you understand why it's right or not, you do what is right and then find out why it's right. So he says, increase your understanding. Don't be so simple in life. But a simple person will just be not complex. It's the teenager who will stop in a doorway to tie up their shoelaces. They think, why are you doing your shoelaces right here? Because, again, simple thoughts produce simple actions and think, shoelace is undone, must stop, must do shoelace. Right, and not realize, right, but there's people coming back and forth. And to be considerate about the environment in which they are living. So Solomon is saying, right, you shouldn't be simple. Don't love your simplicity. Don't love it. He says, to the simple, wisdom cries. And she cries and says, how long, ye simple ones, will ye love simplicity? The other aspect of being simple means to be seducible. It means it can be easily swayed. So a simple person will be seduced by who they're around. It means if they're around people who are laughing and joking and loud, they will be laughing and joking and loud. If that person is around someone who is quiet, then they'll be quiet. If that person is around someone who is doing good things, then they will do good things. If that person is around a person who's doing bad things, then they'll do bad things. It's that simple person is seducible and they are malleable and moldable to the people that they are around. That's what it means to be simple. That's not complex. Then wisdom also cries, Solomon says, not just to the simple, but also to the scorners who delight in their scorning. The scorners delight in their scorning. Scorners means to scorn means to make mouth at. So if you're making mouth at, you're scolding and scorning. So here's what a scorner does, particularly in a teenage setting, and to apply this to a teenage demographic, because that's primarily, though that's not all that Solomon is writing to, he writes to my son and to a teenage demographic. A scorner is one who makes mouth at. They're making mouth at authority. They're scoffing and mocking and laughing. It's the teenagers in church that will pick up the hymn book and deliberately sing the wrong lyrics to the song to be scornful to the setting and try and to make others laugh and to mock the setting. That's what a scorner does. And so he's saying, a scorner, the word also has to do with being an ambassador and a teacher. So a scorner doesn't just make mouth at, they're also trying to be an ambassador and a teacher and a recruiter of evil. They are the ones that if the simple is friends with the scorner, then the scorner is trying deliberately to influence the simple to do wrong. Now, if you know this from times of, again, around teenagers, let's stick with the teenage demographic, even though it's true across all demographics. But there are teenagers who are bad influences on other teenagers. They are bad influences. They are trying to have their friends do wrong. They are scorners. They are recruiters. They are ambassadors for evil. Solomon says later on in Proverbs, he says, cast out the scorner and contentions will cease. Cast out the bad apple, he says, and you'll find that a lot of the problems just magically disappear. That's what Solomon says. He also says that judgments are prepared for the scorner. The scorner has results in life because of his scorning and his antagonism towards authority. But he also says here, so scorners, how long will you delight in your scorning? Isn't that interesting that they delight in it? They delight in their wickedness. They delight in being evil. They delight in mocking authority and being against authority in society. They delight in these things. And wisdom looks at them and says, how long are you going to delight in these things? The other person that he says here is fools. So wisdom also writes to fools. Solomon is the he, wisdom is the she. Solomon says also to the fools, fools, how long are you going to hate knowledge? You're going to hate the knowledge. Don't tell me. The fool blocks his ears. The fool says, I don't want to know. I don't want to be told. I don't want instruction. I don't want to know anything. Don't tell me things. I am just going to live life how I want to live life. They're not necessarily anti-authority. They're not going to go around and deliberately do evil things like the scorner might, but they are deliberate in their foolishness in to say that we don't care about rules and laws and we don't care about the instructions and what the sign says. We're just going to go and do what we want to do. So they hate knowledge. They don't want to be told. And Solomon says that foolishness is bound in the heart of a child, but the rod of correction will drive it far from him. So it's almost like foolishness is the default setting of a child. They don't like being told. They don't like instruction. And there are times in a foolish young child where they want to reject knowledge and reject instruction. And Solomon says, right, but the rod of correction will drive that foolishness from them, and it imparts wisdom into their life, or all of a sudden they say, you know what, this obeying instruction is actually not so bad. It's better than the alternative of the rod of correction. And the rod of correction is supposed to bring pain into the life of a child so that they realize, right, I'm going to obey and heed instruction because that's the way of wisdom. It's the way of wisdom. So you have these four characters, wise, fool, simple, scorner, that are again interwoven through. And every single character ends up in a different location. In life, they end up in a different location. The wise, it says, there is treasure to be desired and oil in the dwelling of the wise. They have money. They're wealthy. They are looked at by everyone else as quote unquote lucky, but they're not lucky. It's a product of wise decisions that produce their result in life. The Bible says, or Solomon goes on to say, he says, the hand of the diligent shall bear rule. You know what that means? It means the wise person is the one who ends up with the promotions. And the fool looks at the wise person. Here's this wise person gets a job. Here are these two 16-year-olds. Or here's a 19-year-old fool and a 16-year-old wise person. And they're both working at Hungry Jack's. Or they're both working at some supermarket. And the 16-year-old wise person is brand new on the job. And they're there for about 3 months, 4 months. And they get promoted. The fool is there, also working, is always complaining, never doing the instructions properly like the boss is asking. They're 19, they look at the 16-year-old and say, well, I've been here for 3 years and you just come in here for 3 months and then you're all of a sudden the golden child. You're the one who all of a sudden the supervisor likes and you get promoted. Man, you're just so lucky. You don't know how lucky you are. I've had to be here for 3 years. And the fool looks at the simple and says he's lucky. But it's not really about luck. It's really about the hand of the diligent shall bear rule. That's a biblical principle. That's wisdom. And that's what Solomon is saying to his son. So they end up, wisdom ends up, the wise person ends up promoted. The wise person ends up with stronger relationships and stronger areas in life. They live longer. They live longer. Wise people on a whole, as a general rule of thumb, live longer than foolish people. You think, what do you mean? Well, the wise person as a teenager says, you know what, I'm not going to drink. The foolishness of drinking. And Solomon talks about the foolishness of drinking in Proverbs chapter number 23, and about they who go to the wine, and they that tarry long at the wine, and they that look at mixed wines. And he says the addiction factor that's there. The wise person comes along and says, you know what, that whole alcohol stuff really isn't for me. The fool comes along and says, don't tell me how to live my life. I'll tell you what, I'm going to go have a good time. I'm going to go drink the alcohol. Or you might be cigarettes, and that teenager comes along and says, and is offered the cigarettes at some point in their life, like just about everyone is offered cigarettes. The wise person says, you know what, I'm not going to take the cigarettes. I don't want to start down that path. The fool is like, yeah, well, everyone else is taking cigarettes. I'll take a cigarette, and we're all out drinking, and now I'll have a cigarette as well. And now they're just smoking, and now 10, 15, 20 years later, they're still smoking, and now they have the health issues that come along with smoking and drinking and habits of those nature. And here is the wise person whose health seems to be much better than the foolish person. And the Bible says that the wise person lives longer than the foolish person. That's a general rule. It's not a promise, it's a probability. That's interesting to note, that the Proverbs are not promises. They're more like probabilities, which means if you do these things, there's a higher probability that these things will occur. So if you act like the wise, there's a higher probability that these things will occur. That doesn't mean that a wise person will always live long life, because some people die young and they're wise and good and godly. So they're not promises as much as they are probabilities. These are how life works. And Solomon deals with these things and addresses these things. So the wise person lives longer, is healthier, happier, promoted in life, and is just overall general spiritual, physical, mental health is better than the fool. The simple also has an area that he lives. He lives his life. If he's around a wise person, the simple are around the wise because they're seducible. They also learn to work hard because they're around the wise person who works hard. And if they are around the wise person, then their speech is like the wise person, and they speak godly, and they act godly, and they do those things because they're influenced by being around the wise. That's what a simple person does. But if the simple gets around the fool, then he is going to act as foolish as the fool. And he is going to be as lazy as the foolish person. And he is going to be hiding away from the supervisor like the fool is hiding away from the supervisor, because he is seducible. Now, he is going to end up, if the simple, because of his seducibility, if he becomes friends with the scorner, he's going to end up where the scorner ends up. Now, the Bible says that judgments are prepared for the back of a scorner. The scorner is the ones that ends up in trouble with the law. That's who a scorner is, because they shun society and shun authority, and they are much more severe than the foolish person in their nature and their demeanor. They're the ones who run from police. They're the ones who graffiti. They're the ones that are teenagers that are breaking letterboxes with baseball bats or whatever else they want to do to do damage. We had a rock thrown through our glass window here. There's one, on those pictures, there's only one boy in that group that was doing that. And in that group, there were simple, and there were fools, and there was a scorner. Not all of them were scorners. And some of those kids in that group that was out here on the patio just 12 months ago, that were there at 2 a.m. in the morning or whenever it was that they smashed the window, there was a scorner in there. But if you were to separate that group of 5 or 6 and you got them all alone by themselves, you'd realize there is actually some nice kids in there. And you think, how on earth are you up here at 2 a.m. in the morning at a church building throwing bricks through a glass door? And this person would say, well, I'm hanging out with him. That's why. And if that person, those girls or those boys, and there was a mix in that particular group, if they hung out with better people, then they would actually do better in life. But they were there at 2 a.m. in the morning out here because they were hanging out with a scorner. Now, if they got rid of that scorner, then that group would actually get better. But there was fools in there as well, and no doubt the simple. And they end up. And there's today, if you were to go to the prison houses, be it Wooroloo or other prisons, you're going to meet some people in there that you're going to say, why are you in prison? Why are you here? And they're the nicest people, and they're calm in their demeanor, and they are in for some crime, and you're thinking, how is it that you're here? And they will say, well, I had a friend once, and he's also doing time, or she's also doing time, and he or she made me the driver of the getaway car, and he went in to steal and did the armed robbery, and I just had to drive the car. And the nice person, the simple, because of his acquaintance and because of his friendship with the scorner, ends up in the same place as the scorner. These are the ways of life. And these are not new to our generation. Solomon, sitting on the throne of his kingdom and the wisdom that God had given him, he looks out over his generation and he's seeing a young generation growing up with his many sons and daughters, and he's saying, man, this generation is foolish, and they're scorners, and there's some simple ones in there, but there's also wisdom is crying to them, is lending forth her voice and saying, don't be simple and don't be foolish and don't be a scorner, be wise. Calling them and drawing them. And the fool puts his fingers in his ears and says, I don't want to listen. And the scorner laughs at such a thing, mocks it all. And the simple is there going, what should I do? What should I do? What are you going to do? What are you going to do? And that's how, and you know what? You know what? The youngest generation in here of Zach and Maddie, and if Axel was here, and Dylan, when they grow up, and Oliver, and they grow up and they have kids, guess what is going to be their kids? Guess what's going to traits they're going to have their kids? They're going to be simples and fools and scorners, and that generation needs wisdom like this generation needs wisdom, like the generation which previous needed wisdom, and 3,000 years ago needs wisdom. And that's what Solomon's writing for. He says, wisdom is crying. Wisdom is putting forth her voice, crying to the simple, to the scorners, to the fools. Come, come, eat of my wine, drink my wine, and eat my bread. I have mingled and mixed it. And there's different results. And so those 4 characters are interwoven through the book of Proverbs. What the wise person does, what the foolish person does. But wisdom is also, if you notice here in verse 20, wisdom crieth without. She uttereth her voice in the streets. She crieth in the chief place of concourse. In the openings of the gates. In the city, she uttereth her voice. Wisdom is presented in the feminine tense. Wisdom is presented in the feminine tense as a woman. She cries, which is an interesting thing. Why does Solomon present wisdom in the feminine tense? But if you look at chapter 2 and verse 1, he says, my son. And in chapter 3, verse 1, he says, my son. And through these early chapters, he writes to my son. He's saying, right, son, I'm going to give you some wisdom, and I want you to get wisdom in this life. I want you to be skillfully adapted to the world in which you are growing up and living in. And this wisdom is presented as a woman, because what is more compatible for a young man in life than a woman? That's how God has designed this world. He made man, and then he made a companion suitable for man, woman, and they were to be life companions. Now he is saying to his son, my son, you are a son. Here is the life companion that you should choose. Now, when you choose a wife, when a young man goes to choose a wife, there is quite the options out there. There is a ton of options out there to marry and to choose a wife. And not all the women are of equal status. There are those who look very beautiful on the outside, and they put all the makeup and all the hair, and they present, and they're trim and they're taut, and they've got an Instagram account, and they present all of themselves. But Solomon says there are those women he calls strange women. He says they allure after the lust of the flesh. They twinkle the eyes, and they speak flattering words. And he says, Solomon says to his son, he says, these women, they're going to try and entice you. He says, but you need to learn to reject those women, even though they present beautiful, they are rottenness to the bones, is what he says. And he says, I want you to choose wisely, and to choose a wise woman as your companion, as your wife. And he is saying, right, so wisdom, he's saying, for this young son, he says there's a wise woman and there's the strange woman, the foolish woman. And both of those, that young man can choose. He can choose the wise woman, or he can choose the foolish woman. And as you get to the end, at the Proverbs 31, you will find that the wise woman does him good all the days of his life. But the foolish woman is contentious and cantankerous and problematic. So much so, as you read through, these are things to pay attention to. He's saying the foolish woman is the woman where the man, he says, the continual dropping on a very rainy day, drip, 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 and the contentions of the foolish woman are alike. He's saying the contentions of the woman and the continual dropping on a rainy day are alike, continually bearing away. That's not a wise woman. Now again, you might read that and say, he's saying, is he just merely writing about females? Well, he's not. He's not only writing about that. But is that true? Does Solomon know something about women? 700 wives, 300 concubines in his harem, 1,000 women Solomon had in his harem. Does he know something about women? I'd say yes. And he can say, man, there were times, and this is what if you read through this, he says there are times where he says it's better to dwell in the corner of a housetop than in a very wide house with a contentious woman. That's what he says. He says, I'd much rather just hide away. And Solomon was trying to hide away from 1,000 women. And he says, there are times, he says, I just want to go. And if you read on, you find that he says, it's better to dwell on the rooftop than to dwell in a wide house with a contentious woman. And he's like, man, you know what? I've got to get out of the house. I'm going to the rooftop. I'm escaping. And then you read on, and you'll find a few chapters later, and he says, it's better to dwell in the wilderness than to dwell in a wide house with a contentious woman, with the foolish woman. Because he's saying, right, it may seem good at the very beginning, and you're lured in by the lusts of the flesh and the beauty and whatever, but he says the end does not, the foolish woman and the strange woman doesn't do you good all the days of your life. There's heartache and misery down that path. And he's not just talking about women, though the context of what he is writing to his son, he's saying, right, make sure you choose your wife carefully. Young men, make sure you choose your wives carefully. He is writing like that. But the other layer to what he's saying is you have a choice in life to choose the godly wisdom or the foolish wisdom. The wisdom from above or the wisdom from beneath. And he says you're going to choose these. and they are not going to give equal results. The wise woman builds her house. The foolish woman plucks it down with her hands. She does the exact opposite thing to what a wise woman does. A wise woman builds a strong household. The foolish woman is like she is destroying her very own house. Now, he's comparing that towards wisdom. The wisdom of God has a vastly different results in a person's life than what foolishness does. But foolishness has its allure, because it allures to the lust of the flesh. So he presents wisdom in the feminine tense towards his son, and also the juxtaposition of wisdom being the strange woman. And he writes, so when you read about the strange woman and wisdom, think of it. Realize that there's two layers there. One is a very practical element of who are you going to marry in life, young man? And, all right, to everybody, what wisdom are you going to choose in life? The wisdom of God or the wisdom of this world? The wisdom of this world has the lipstick on and the perfume and allures and flatters and says, I'll give you a good time now. But it's bitterness and rottenness to the bones in the end. But the wise woman may not present quite as voluptuously or seductively, but she will do you good all the days of your life. That's what the wisdom of God does to a Christian, and the world is a strange woman to the Christian. And yet the strange woman is a temptress also to the Christian. Just as today, someone may be married to wisdom and still be tempted with the world. He's using the things of this world to teach about wisdom. Also this, so not just that there's two layers here in wisdom in the book of Proverbs, there's one other element that I want you to pay attention to as you read through the book of Proverbs, is that the personification of wisdom is Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is the personification of wisdom. He is wisdom in person, is who Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is in every book of the Bible. The Bible is about Jesus Christ. From Genesis to Revelation, it's about Jesus. And so wisdom is about also Jesus Christ. Now we read in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, I think, where he talks about that we preach the wisdom of God. Jesus Christ is the wisdom of God, he says in 1 Corinthians chapter number 1. Now think about Jesus Christ as you read this verse. Verse 24. But I have called, and ye refused. I have stretched out my hand, and no man regarded. So there is this one element of a purely practical element. This is a father speaking to a son. All right, let's take a very practical element of this. So you can read verse number 24 like this. I have called and ye refused. A father speaking to a son. I've tried to impart wisdom. I've tried to give you wisdom and you've rejected me. And I'm trying to teach you. Please be wise. Don't be a fool. There's that element to it. But you also have Solomon saying about wisdom is calling. Wisdom is calling. Please be wise. Be wise. And I have called and ye have refused. But then there's also another element to it where Jesus Christ is the personification of wisdom. So Jesus calls. His message goes into all the world that they might be saved through Jesus Christ, that he is the wisdom of God. And what do fools do? They say, I don't want to hear. Block the ears. I don't want to hear about Jesus. I want to hear about salvation. I want to hear about the Bible. I don't want to hear about God. That's a fool. What's the scorner do when Jesus Christ is presented and preached? They mock and laugh and ridicule. And what does the simple do? Well, if he's around the fool, he's going to reject and say, I'm not interested. If he's around the scorner, he's going to mock as well. Jesus Christ. But Jesus, the message of Jesus goes forth saying, be wise, trust me, and I will give you eternal life and the wisdom that is there. I have called and ye refused. I have stretched out my hand, and no man regarded. And ye have set at naught all my counsel, and would none of my reproof, which is exactly what they did when Jesus Christ walked the earth. They did not listen to him. They have set at naught all my counsel, and would none of my reproof. I also will laugh at your calamity, and I will mock when your fear cometh. When your fear cometh as desolation, and your destruction cometh as a whirlwind, when distress and anguish come upon you, which it always does upon the fool and upon the scorner. Distress and anguish and sorrow of heart comes upon them. And in those moments, what do they want? Wisdom. They're about to go bankrupt. They're about to go whatever. The products of foolishness. They're crying out for wisdom. And what does wisdom do in that moment? Mocks and ridicules and mocks the scorner, because the scorner mocked wisdom when the offer was given. And it's not that wisdom is mocking them, but that's the only response that can be given to the scorner in their calamity. They have rejected wisdom, and therefore they must face the consequences of their choice. There's no other remedy. It's too late. They must reap what they have sown. So he goes on, I will laugh at their calamity and will mock when your fear cometh. When your fear cometh as desolation, and your destruction cometh as a whirlwind, when distress and anguish cometh upon you, then shall they call upon me, but I will not answer. That's what the fool does, sitting in the hospital bed with a broken arm. Oh, I wish I could go back and read that sign instead of jumping into that river where it said no diving. But it's too late. It's too late at that moment. And there's going to come a time where people who reject Jesus Christ are going to wish they could go back and make a wise decision about the personification of wisdom, Jesus Christ, but it's going to be too late. Then shall they call upon me. Then shall they call upon me, but I will not answer. They shall seek me early, but they shall not find me. For that they hated knowledge and did not choose the fear of the Lord. They did not choose the fear of the Lord. Do you know why? Because wisdom is a choice. It's not a DNA genetic thing that's in some people and not in others. Wisdom is a choice. You either choose to be wise, and if you are wise, God gives you more wisdom. If you are wise of heart, God gives you more wisdom. If you are foolish, God actually removes what wisdom you do have, and you get worse. For that they hated the knowledge and did not choose the fear of the Lord. They would none of my counsel. They despised all my reproof. Therefore shall they eat the fruit of their own ways and be filled with their own devices. For the turning away of the simple shall slay them, and the prosperity of fools shall destroy them. But whoso hearkeneth unto me shall dwell safely and shall be quiet from all evil. That's wisdom speaking. Wisdom is speaking to young men. Simple, don't just turn away and then forget about what you've been told. Fools, don't just block your ears and say, my life is fine. My life is prosperous. I have a good job, money in the bank. I'm living my life how I want to live my life. Don't let your prosperity slay you. That's what wisdom is saying to these people. But he's saying, whosoever hearkens and listens, hearkens unto me, shall dwell safely and shall be quiet from fear of evil. Wisdom is a choice, and wisdom is crying. And as you read through the book of Proverbs, understand that wisdom is speaking to you, and to you, and to you, and to me. Wisdom cries as you read these books. Are you just going to ignore it? And the things that are written in there, you say, oh, that's good to know. No, it's good to do. That's what it's about, is to do these things that are contained in there. To not just be a fool, because fools and simples and scorners are of all ages, and wise are all of all ages. This is what the Bible is written for. It's written to all of us to learn. And you say, I'm already married. Right, it's not necessarily about that again. I say, are you going to choose the wisdom of the Lord? Are you going to choose the fear of the Lord? For the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. That's where it starts. And if you reject God and His knowledge and His word, that's the path to foolishness, and there's consequences either way. And so Proverbs is a skill book. It's a book about how to live life skillfully. And that way comes from the fear of the Lord. and it comes from living righteously. So pay attention and read through it, and it's interesting and fascinating, and I love the book of Proverbs, and it's worth our learning and worth our time to read through it this particular month. Cohel, would you like to come and lead us in a song? And we'll close with this. Find your hymn books. And we'll close with a song, the first and the last verse.
178.